when I was in London in early September, but I checked with him before I went to see Bremer, and he had not been deputy administrator and thought that, on balance, that was probably the right arrangement. There were disadvantages both ways, but the UK had a separate responsibility and needed to be able to put a veto down on the table if it disagreed with the way that the United States was handling things, and you could not do that if you were deputy to an American administrator.
But we've heard that on the military side there was no difficulty in the senior British officer being a deputy to the American senior military commander. So did this create a disjunction between the civil military sides of what was going on in Iraq?
I don't think so. I think the military probably have to have a single chain of command. The political situation was, in structural terms, more complicated than the military situation. And therefore, that didn't surprise me that there was a dichotomy there.
But if you were talking about being able to exercise some sort of veto and not being a deputy to Bremer, did that mean, in some way, that almost puts you in the position of being ambassador to Iraq, or in some way Bremer having an accountability to the British government through you, but that certainly never happened.
No, that's what I tried to establish, that Bremer had a direct responsibility to London, but in practice he did not report to London. He relied on me to do that and to tell London what was going on. If London disagreed with something that the United States was doing or wanted something to be done that was not happening, London would talk to Washington.
Thank you.
Perhaps as we go through the story, you can just identify to us, not now, but as we go through it, the points at which you actually exercise this power of veto. But let's leave that. I think Usha would like to get back.
Yes, can I come back to your earlier comment when you said that for Bremer, the line of responsibility was sort of, Pentagon, that was the apex. What was the apex in London? I mean, where was the command coming from London? Was it number 10? Was it the FCO?
The apex in London was the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister had appointed me, and the Prime Minister expected me to work to him, but, of course, in the British system, you work to the system. In practice, there was a triangle in the British arrangement, which was the foreign policy advisor to the Prime Minister, number 10, Nigel Sheinwald, when he was in that position, the political director in the Foreign Office, John Sawyers, in that position at that time, and myself in Baghdad. We would have triangular teleconferences and other means of communication, and if the three of us were clear that this was the way to go, it was my job to get that done in Baghdad, persuade Ambassador Bremer or whatever. It was their job to make sure that they were acting with ministerial authority in London. I came back to London once a month during my 6.5 months in Baghdad, and when I came back to London, I would talk to ministers, normally to the Prime Minister amongst other ministers, as well as to officials. So although it's like a multiplied arrangement, it's entirely normal to the British system that officials will work on a daily routine basis with their ranking officials, and that it's London's job within the system that officials make sure that they have ministerial clearance for instructions that they give overseas.
And did you feel that the lines of communication were effective in terms of what you reported back, action was taken?
Yes, I mean, there was understanding and clarity about the lines of reporting. That's not to say that there was understanding and clarity about how we got the job done and what resources were needed, but the communication and the line of command back to the Prime Minister was, to my mind, not a problem.
So what you're saying is the line of communications were fine, but they were not necessarily responsive to what was needed and what was the situation like on the ground.
Yes, to the latter, but that was primarily because we were having to follow the Americans in almost everything that we did, and we could not achieve the filling of gaps where we perceived gaps unless the Americans did most of the heavy lifting in that respect.
I mean, before the break, you said that, you know, the arrangements were theoretical at, you know, when they were agreed, and of course you've given reasons in response to my colleagues' questions about why you decided not to be a deputy to Bremer. But how did it actually work on the ground in terms of the cohesiveness of the CPA, in terms of, you know, how did you work with the British team, and how did you go about actually influencing what the Americans were doing?
By trial and error. There was a considerable British input into the CPA. I'm talking here about the civilian side of things. I observed the military, but wasn't part of that. If the CPA was roughly 1,200 people, the Brits were about 100, between 90 and 100 of those 1,200. Most of those British were working within the CPA under the administrator. I was off to one side as the UK satellite, if you like, with my own small private office and advisors. And my first responsibility, and I said this to Ambassador Bremer when I first telephoned him on his own appointment, as soon as I knew that I would be coming, was loyalty to him and support for him in getting our joint job done in Iraq. And it was the American approach, and it was certainly Ambassador Bremer's approach, that the duty of anybody working in Baghdad, including the separate British representative, was A, loyalty to the United States, and B, practical support for what they were doing. I tried to provide that on every possible occasion through liaison with London, using whatever materials I had to hand. If it came to disagreement with Bremer, or my wishing to suggest that we should think of things in a different way from the way he was thinking, that was a matter of discussion between me and Ambassador Bremer. But
what were the main areas where there were disagreements or differences in approach and objectives?
Well, he had an approach which was, I think I would call it a driving approach. He had his instructions from his president. He had his 7 steps plan, which you know about.
Yes, indeed.
And he thought that the way to implement that plan was to create momentum behind it, and he expected me to be part of that momentum. The second or third day I was in Baghdad, Secretary Colin Powell came on a short visit, and Bremer and I sat in Bremer's office to talk about the political process. And I was asked for my views by Secretary Powell. And I suggested, as I had done to Bremer in Washington in July, that it would be wise to think of options, political options. What if things don't happen as we predict, as often does happen in an unusual situation?
In other words, not